With Tobey Maguire's Spider-Man, along with a slew of other characters from the classic early 2000s Spider-Man trilogy, such as Alfred Molina's Doc Ock and William Dafoe's Green Goblin likely showing up in No Way Home, we thought now was a good time to revisit the trilogy that first brought us Spidey to the big screen, and 25 things you may have missed. This includes references to other Marvel and even DC characters subtly hidden in the movies, cool pieces of trivia and behind-the-scenes stories, and some familiar cameos you might have forgotten about. Let's take a look. Now, there are many comic book Easter eggs in the original trilogy, most of them relating to Marvel, and in particular Spider-Man, but we wanted to start off with a reference to Marvel's main rival, DC. Now, you would likely have caught this one if you were a comic book fan, but while Peter tries to get his organic web slinging to work, which everyone loves, right? He tries out a number of different catchphrases. Two of these catchphrases are gags at DC's expense, with Up and Away Web being a Superman reference, and Shazam being a, well, you can guess what that's a reference to. But, as we said, most of the Easter eggs in the series are Marvel references, with some less known than others. An example of this is the reference to a Marvel character named Stingray. For those who don't know, Dr. Walter Newell, aka Stingray, was created in the 60s and is an expert oceanographer and engineer who designed a unique suit for deep sea exploration, basing the look on manta rays, and has ended up working alongside Namor a bunch of times. How does he relate to the Spider-Man trilogy though? Well, while designing potential costume ideas, Peter sketches one that happens to look a lot like Stingray's suit. Sorry Spidey, that one's already taken. Now, as you know, Spider-Man 3, along with Tobey Maguire's amazing dance skills, has a ton of different villains, and arguably too many. However, while Venom and Sandman had to wait till the third movie to finally appear, one of them was actually briefly referenced in the first movie. During the moment J. Jonah Jameson is introduced, he does what he does best and rants about how Spider-Man is a menace to society and is ultimately frustrated that no one can get a photograph of the feckless, treacherous, unhinged menace. Jameson's words, not mine. In the scene, one of Jameson's underlings says the line, "Eddie's been trying to get a picture of him for weeks," which of course is a reference to Eddie Brock, who, as you know, later becomes Venom. If there's one thing Marvel love, it's alliteration. You know, like Peter Parker, J. Jonah Jameson, Green Goblin, Matt Murdock, Bucky Barnes, Doctor Doom, Reed Richards, and my personal favorite, Fin Fang Foom, just to name a few. But anyway, that's just a cheap segue to get to my actual point. There is a Fin Fang Foom Easter egg in the trilogy. Well, maybe. In Norman Osborn's residence, we can see a weird green mask, which looks like it could potentially be a reference to the dragon's head, although it's an albeit weird reference. Keeping on with the references to Marvel characters, in the scene where Peter picks up some flowers while on his way to MJ's play, we can see two types of flowers with the cards carnations and snapdragons above them. These were apparently particularly chosen by Raimi because they were a reference to two different villains, Snapdragon and Carnage, which is pretty cool seeing as the latter is set to appear in the Venom sequel. While the Carnage Carnation one might be seen as, you know, a little bit of a stretch, you've got to say the Snapdragon one is a pretty great Easter egg. One character that's easy to forget was in the original trilogy was Dr. Kirk Connors, who is better known as his alter ego, Lizard. Although he never got to go into his reptilian form in the original trilogy and had to wait till The Amazing Spider-Man with Andrew Garfield. And if the theories are to be believed, No Way Home. But that doesn't mean his alter ego isn't at least referenced in Spider-Man 3. As Connors calls Peter to tell him of his parasite's influence and the ramifications, if you look closely in the background, you'll be able to see the skeleton of, you guessed it, a lizard. Speaking of No Way Home though, while Lizard and others on this list are rumored to be playing a role in the movie, one character that will be playing a prominent part in the film is Doctor Strange, unless of course he's Mephisto. However, his connection to Spidey runs deeper than just the MCU, and although he didn't appear in the original trilogy, he did at least get a shout out. In Spider-Man 2, as Jameson and co. are debating on what alias to give Otto Octavius, they nearly land on another Doctor title, with the name Doctor Strange touted, until of course they remember it's already taken by a certain neurosurgeon. It's no secret that Stan Lee cameos in basically every Marvel movie, and the original trilogy is no different, but Lee isn't the only important Marvel name to get a mention in the series. Steve Ditko was another man alongside Lee and Jack Kirby that played a huge part in Marvel being a success, and his ties to Spider-Man are particularly strong, so it's no wonder Raimi paid tribute to the legend in his films. In Spider-Man 2, Peter's relentless landlord, who has been eternalized in meme form for him is called Mr. Dickovich, which, well, giving your name to a grumpy landlord who is always looking for rent may not sound like the best tribute, but we think it's pretty nice. Now, to be honest, you probably already caught this one, but we wanted to mention it just in case. As Peter waits for MJ at the theater, he comes across a woman playing a familiar song on the violin, with it clearly being the tune of the classic 1960s Spider-Man theme, which now I bet is firmly stuck in your head, isn't it? Honestly, how can it not be? Darn it. As you know, Harry Osborn steps into his father's shoes as the Green Goblin, and he is shown continuing his father's legacy through a montage in the third film. However, it's alluded that he nearly became a very different villain during this montage. Hobgoblin. Okay, not really a very different villain, seeing as Hobgoblin is a supervillain copycat of Green Goblin. But during the montage, we see a silver version of the Goblin mask, which is more than likely a reference to Hobgoblin. Throughout the trilogy, Raimi makes more subtle, hilarious puns pertaining to spiders and arachnids in general, with the inclusion of an Alfa Romeo spider, an advert for pest control, and the copious amounts of spider-themed headlines in the Daily Bugle. But one that mostly went unnoticed is the reference to Lucio Fulci's 1981 movie The Beyond, where a man is bitten to death by arachnids. As Peter transforms into his spider self, a silhouette of a spider can be seen flashing on screen, and it was a shot taken directly by Raimi from The Beyond. This one goes out to all the comic book fans out there, which I assume is most of you given the subject matter, but if you're a big Spidey fan, you will most likely be familiar with the Easter egg in Spider-Man 3 in the bell tower. In the scene, Peter removes the symbiote within a church bell tower, with Eddie Brock down below, and the scene is pretty much taken straight out of the comics. It is an iconic moment in the comics, and the imagery is so memorable that the scene in the movie is almost a complete recreation of that moment. Sometimes companies pay bucket loads of cash to advertise in a movie, especially a big budget Marvel one. I mean, take a look at the opening of Far From Home, for example. That's literally just an Audi commercial. Or the moment Bond drives a Ford in the Bahamas in Casino Royale. Or all the Heineken bottles in Skyfall. Or just Bond movies in general, really. But anyway, I'm getting really off topic here. In Spider-Man 2, one company got to advertise for free. Joe's Pizzeria, that Peter Parker works for as a delivery boy, is actually a real pizza joint in Greenwich Village. And if you were to call the number on Peter's helmet, you would indeed get through to Joe's Pizza, and could order yourself a hot slice of pie, which we'd recommend, seeing as they are apparently known as one of the best pizza places in New York City. So yeah, give them a call. If you want to buy pizza, please don't call them just to spam them. Unless you want spam on your pizza, never mind. While Flash Thompson is one of the more prominent characters in the MCU Spider-Man series, with him being played by the Grand Budapest actor Tony Revolori, he was also in the Raimi series, and was played by none other than Deathstroke Joe Manganiello, and you would be forgiven for forgetting that because he looks wildly different. Flash appeared in the first Spider-Man where he liked to pick on Peter until he got his butt kicked, but he actually made a return in the third movie with him appearing at Harry's funeral, suggesting that maybe he turned a corner in his life and is actually alright now. Maybe getting his butt kicked by Peter was a good thing. Now, if you're a horror nerd, or a herd as I like to say, you will probably know this one already, but again, I figured I'd put it in here anyway. We're referring to the multiple cameos of Bruce Campbell, who has worked with Sam Raimi on multiple occasions and is good friends with the director. Campbell appears in all three movies, with him being the ring announcer in the first film, a theater usher in the second one, and a French maitre d' in the third. Here's a further piece of Bruce Campbell related trivia for you. You may also recognize his voice from the Spider-Man video games, with Campbell announcing all the tutorial levels. While the VFX in the series may look a little dated now, at the time they were pretty groundbreaking, and 8-year-old me had my mind blown by how cool it looked. Raimi also appreciated how good the movies looked, and wanted to pay tribute to the special effects director John Fraser in the series. In Spider-Man 2, while MJ waits for her boyfriend, you can see on a poster in the background saying Jay Fraser is especially effective, which is a little homage to the Oscar-winning VFX guru. Say what you want about Spider-Man 3, one positive we have to give it is it remembers where it came from, and the movies that came before it. An example of this are the pictures that can be seen on Peter's desk in the apartment. The reason for this is that if you look closely, you will notice that the pictures are the very same ones Peter took during the laboratory visit. You know, the one that turned him into Spider-Man in the very first movie. It's a nice touch and reminded us how far their relationship had come. Like the bell tower scene in Spider-Man 3, the moment Green Goblin drops MJ while making Peter choose between the woman woman he loves and a load of school children, is taken from the comics, although there are a couple alterations. The main one being that in the comics, it's actually Gwen Stacy that took the plunge, and she died as a result of being caught in the crossfire. When David Fincher was attached to the project, he planned on having Gwen Stacy in the movie and having her die in this scene, but Raimi changed this, sparing both MJ and the children, but keeping the moment Goblin is impaled by his own glider. Continuing on with the direct references to the comic books, the scene where Peter enters a wrestling competition so he can win some cash, but instead ends up getting Uncle Ben killed unintentionally, is taken from the comics. Amazing Fantasy number 15, Spider-Man ends up in a wrestling competition before the death of his beloved uncle, and it is also where the "with great power comes great responsibility" moment came from. Now, I know what you're gonna say here, and I know we've covered this a few times on this channel already, so it's not likely to be something you missed, but just on the off chance that you didn't know this one by now, the lunch tray scene where Peter catches everything in one go was done for real. This meant the scene was done without the use of VFX, but instead an adhesive to make sure everything stayed in place. But the scene wasn't easy, with it taking Maguire 156 takes to get it right. But you have to say, the end result is pretty awesome. Another scene that was difficult to shoot was the very famous and iconic upside down kiss in the rain, which has been recreated in parody on multiple occasions. Apparently though, it was a bit of a nightmare to actually pull off, with it taking numerous takes and water had to be constantly removed from Maguire's nose as he kept flooding. As we said earlier, everyone loved the organic web shooters, right? No? They didn't? Oh, well, I'm gonna be honest with you here. I actually kind of like them. I mean, I know it's disgusting and anatomically incorrect, but I like it. And I know that's an unpopular opinion, but there you go. Anyway, the idea for the organic web shooters actually wasn't Raimi's, and was the brainchild of another director attached to the project, James Cameron. Cameron's Spider-Man movie was massively different, and would have starred Leonardo DiCaprio as Peter Parker, and would have had a darker vibe than Raimi's trilogy, but it ended up being scrapped. Other directors who were linked with the movie were Ang Lee, M. Night Shyamalan, Roland Emmerich, and as we mentioned, David Fincher. Speaking of the Cameron version though, while Sandman did show up in Spider-Man 3 and Electro in The Amazing Spider-Man 2, they were very nearly the main villains in Spider-Man before Green Goblin, with them being attached to be the primary villains, but both ended up hitting the cutting room floor. Speaking of Green Goblin though, while William Dafoe crushed it as Norman Osborn, it's hard to imagine any other actors playing the role. There were a whole host of nearly goblins. The considered actors included Bill Paxton, Mel Gibson, Charlie Sheen, John Travolta, John Malkovich, and the one and only Nicolas Cage. Other than Bruce Campbell, there are a number of cameos that appear in the series. Some of them you might have known, some of them you might have forgotten, and others you might have missed entirely. They include Lucy Lawless, Elizabeth Banks, Randy Savage, Octavia Spencer, Stan Lee, obviously, and even Tobey Maguire's younger half-brothers, who are the kids on the train that sees Peter's face and tell him they won't tell nobody. While we have been pretty complimentary of the trilogy, because we do genuinely love it, we do have to poke fun at it slightly. That is because it pulls off somewhat of a VFX/continuity goof. As Peter swings away from Times Square with Mary Jane in his arms, and Kirsten Dunst cleans onto what is clearly a mannequin, he is shown swinging from left to right, while Mary Jane's hair blows back from her face as if he was swinging from right to left. Yes, it's trivial, and yes, it doesn't mean anything in the grand scheme of things, but we thought we'd throw it in there. As I have a little bit of time here, I thought I'd just throw in a few more things. While there were some liberties taken by the filmmakers in the trilogy, with alterations being made from the typical comic book locations, such as Oscorp changing from a skyscraper to a smoky factory, and new names and places created just for the movie alone, there is one that does stay true to the comics: Midtown High. In both the comics and the MCU, Midtown High is the place that Peter Parker spent high school years, and Raimi, staying true to the comics, made sure that the school Peter attends in the first Spider-Man was also Midtown High. And also another quick piece of trivia, after the first Spider-Man, Tobey Maguire ended up injuring his back on the set of Seabiscuit, and was almost unable to return to the role of Peter Parker for Spider-Man 2. So, Sony began negotiations with Jake Gyllenhaal and had him lined up as Maguire's replacement. But thankfully for Maguire, he managed to heal in time and ended up keeping his role, leaving Gyllenhaal to wait till Far From Home to be in a Spider-Man movie.
With Tom Holland's third solo outing as Spider-Man fast approaching, we thought it might be a good time to look back on the most forgotten iteration of the character, The Amazing Spider-Man 1 and 2. Andrew Garfield's take on the classic Marvel character might be returning in No Way Home after all, and bringing his love of lasagna and disdain for Mondays with him. Yeah, sorry, I regret that bit already. Anyway, let's take a look back and dig up 25 Easter eggs and little details you probably missed or forgot in The Amazing Spider-Man. Let's start ourselves off with a little bit that The Amazing Spider-Man 2 takes directly from the comics. When Peter clashes with Electro for the first time, he sprays him down with a fire hose. He's even wearing a fireman's helmet, which is a weirdly whimsical choice for these movies, but whatever. This method of shorting Electro out has its origins in The Amazing Spider-Man issue number 9, where Peter rolls out the same trick to deal with the villain after conventional methods of putting him down fail. It's an interesting scene, as well as one that shows off just how versatile and creative Peter is as a fighter. Let's move on to a double hit of references to the comics that spans both movies. In the final web-slinging sequence of The Amazing Spider-Man, there is a prominent shot where the George Washington Bridge appears in the background. The famous bridge, which spans the Hudson River from Upper Manhattan to Fort Lee, New Jersey, is the site of Gwen Stacy's original fatal fall in the comics. Director Mark Webb has gone on record that this is an explicit reference to her impending doom in the sequel. Of course, what's the setup without the execution? The Amazing Spider-Man 2 may have changed the location of Gwen Stacy's death, giving us a complicated sequence in and around a clock tower, but the sequence hides another reference to the comics. As the sequence plays out, the audience is shown the face of the malfunctioning clock tower, which eventually settles on displaying the time as 1:21. Gwen, of course, met her original fate in issue 121 of The Amazing Spider-Man. Now, how about something a little lighter and more life-affirming? In The Amazing Spider-Man 2, Gwen Stacy gets a dog while she and Peter are broken up. And that dog? Well, it's the actual pooch of the film stars and, at the time, real-life couple, Emma Stone and Andrew Garfield. Oh god, now I'm thinking about that poor dog being orphaned. And who's gonna take care of it now? Peter? That guy's a mess. I would not trust him with a goldfish. Okay, this one's actually more fun. In the first Amazing Spider-Man, Peter has a poster up in his room for Alfred Hitchcock's Rear Window. Rear Window, of course, is all about a determined photojournalist who has to solve a murder and catch the killer on his own. Oh, now I swear I've heard that story somewhere else too. Something about a dead uncle and a larger than usual amount of responsibility. The transformation into Spider-Man is a time-honored tradition in film, or at least it is in Spider-Man films. It would be weird if there was one in like Star Wars. Not that Disney can't make my fanfiction come true. Anyway, Peter or Miles Morales get bit by that pesky radioactive spider and then it's Mutation City, baby. Getting your DNA rewritten by atomic spider venom is a handy stand-in for puberty, and if you happen to get real tall, real fast as a teen, then you know how much that can hurt. Peter's hazy, freaked out transformation in The Amazing Spider-Man honors that legacy, but it also hides Spidey's signature symbol on the back of Peter's skateboard as Peter rests on a subway car and gets into a little trouble with some local ruffians. Say what you want about the films, Mark Webb came into these things with a plan. During a scene set in an Oscorp lab in the first Amazing Spider-Man, you can spot a prominently placed photo of a rhinoceros in a holographic display. Webb has said that this was a specific reference to his desire to use the rhino as a villain in the sequel, even if he did end up being Paul Giamatti in a big robot suit, and not Paul Giamatti as a gigantic CGI muscle man. One of the biggest ideas to come out of the Amazing Spider-Man series was the idea of doing an entire film dedicated to and centering on the villainous Sinister Six. The second film does a lot of the groundwork needed to establish such a project, and it's loaded up with hints and references to the villains who never came, including a hidden sequence set in an Oscorp building where Doc Ock's tentacles and the Vulture's wings are on prominent display. While we never got to see the Sinister Six in action, that scene did still end up being a hint of things to come, as Sony's Spider-Man Homecoming would take the Vulture off the bench a few years later. One of the sad realities of the Amazing Spider-Man films is that they suffer from a profound lack of J. Jonah Jameson. I mean, come on, he's essential. Far From Home even brought J.K. Simmons back to fill the role again. While the character may never appear on screen, however, his shadow looms large in The Amazing Spider-Man 2. And what does such a shadow want? It wants pictures. Pictures of Spider-Man. Thankfully, Peter Parker always delivers. And in one scene, you can spot a bit of an email exchange that he's having with the Daily Bugle's most imposing editor-in-chief. Superhero and villain outfits are a hard sell in movies. What needs to be fairly simple and offer a distinct silhouette on a 4-color page calls for extra details and practical touches on the big screen. And while a guy wrapped up in green spandex with a bright yellow star on his face might seem less outlandish in a post-Suicide Squad world, Electro got a major facelift for his appearance in The Amazing Spider-Man 2. However, in one scene, Max does have a birthday cake that is all done up in the signature comics colors of yellow lightning bolts with green trim. Of course, it's just not a Spider-Man movie without a little visit from our old buddy. No, not Stan Lee. I'm talking about the 1960s cartoon theme. As you might expect, Peter uses the catchy little jingle as his ringtone and whistles it during a fight with the Rhino, which leads us to the question, what is that song called in a universe where Spider-Man is real? Who would write such a thing, and why? Mark Webb's Spider films owe a lot to the comics that inspired them, and while they may make some superficial changes, they still pay service to the source material. Take, for instance, the scene where Peter falls through a roof while he's tailing the guy who shot Uncle Ben. It's no accident that he falls through into an abandoned wrestling ring, a clear homage to the original Peter Parker testing out his powers and trying to win a little money by climbing into the ring. Sadly, there's no bone saw, but he still gets the idea to make his costume from a luchador poster. This one is less of an Easter egg and more of an extended gag across both films, but hey, it still hinges on eggs. In The Amazing Spider-Man, Aunt May asks Peter to grab her some eggs from the store. What follows is a running gag where he forgets them, remembers them, and then gets them smashed in one of his showdowns with the Lizard. And lest we forget that Aunt May has an insatiable hunger for high-protein snacks and good cholesterol, you can also spot an email from her in Peter's inbox in the second film. Her request? More eggs. The lady just loves a good omelet. Here's a quick one that you can miss if you blink at the right moment. While Paul Giamatti's Rhino is making Peter miss his high school graduation, Spider-Man pantses the guy mid-fight. And what's on our villain's boxers? Little rhinos. You know, because he's the Rhino. They can't all be winners, folks. This is also the scene where Peter whistles the Spider-Man theme during the fight, which is pretty slapstick. These movies were kinda goofy, huh? The Amazing Spider-Man 2 is, on top of all the Sinister Six setup, chock full of side characters who could be expanded out into full-blown standards of the comic world, so let's take a look at a few of them. First up is Alistair Smythe, played in the film by BJ Novak. Smythe is an Oscorp employee who goads Max Dillon, aka Electro, into villainy. He also happens to share a name with the guy who went on to be the Spider Slayer in the comics, seeking revenge against both Peter and J. Jonah Jameson for the death of his robot suit-building dad. Next up is Felicia Hardy, played here by Felicity Jones. Hardy makes a couple of small appearances circling the Harry Osborn plot. She also happens to share a name with the talented burglar and part-time Peter Parker love interest Black Cat. Hardy might not steal anything here that we know of, but hey, Gwen Stacy was going to be dead going into the proposed third film, so maybe she was being eyed as a new love interest. Finally, here's a quick one on the character's reference front. During a scene set in the Ravencroft Institute, there's a quick look at a plaque commemorating a Dr. Thomas Warren. Now, the plaque says that Warren died in 1994, but eagle-eyed fans will also know that there is a Miles Warren in Spider-Man lore, the talented genetics researcher who goes on to become the villainous Jackal. It could be a coincidence, but in a film so invested in setting up multiple future villains, that does not feel too likely. This one is both an Easter egg and a fun coincidence. In The Amazing Spider-Man 2, Harry Osborn has a scene where he scrolls through a bunch of files left to him by his father. Eagle-eyed viewers can spot references to Oscorp projects that seem tied to other Spider-Man villains, namely Venom, Morbius, the Living Vampire, and Dr. Octopus. This was probably intended to tie into the third film and proposed Sinister Six movie, but here's the weird part. All three of those guys are appearing in new movies in the next year. Here's one that doesn't rely on Spider-Man lore to appreciate. In the second film, the Ravencroft Institute scenes were shot on location at the State University of New York's Maritime College in the Bronx. Given its history as an academic institution, they didn't have to change a whole lot, but the production did pay respect to the school by putting up a list of distinguished naval officers and graduates on a plaque of prominent researchers who worked at the institute. It's not big, but it adds a nice little bit of believability to the portrayal of Spider-Man's version of Arkham. This one's pretty easy. We already talked about Gwen Stacy's death in issue 121 of The Amazing Spider-Man and how Mark Webb knows his spider lore, so let's take a look at Gwen's outfit at the time of her death. Mirroring her comic counterpart from that fateful issue, Emma Stone is decked out in boots, a short purple dress, and a mint green jacket. So obviously, there was a lot of track laid in The Amazing Spider-Man 2 for the much discussed Sinister Six spinoff, but here's a reference that you would have to go deeper than the comics for. In the film, actor Michael Massey plays a guy named Gustav Fiers, who meets with Harry Osborn to discuss general villain stuff. Fiers, some of you may know, is also the man who assembles and organizes the Sinister Six in a trilogy of novels by author Adam Troy Castro. Here's one that you might have missed in all of the chaos of the fight scene. In the climax of The Amazing Spider-Man 2, while Electro is dodging Peter, he keeps bouncing around between some gigantic electrical conductor devices. Each one of the conductors plays a different tone when he hits it, and before too long, the movie's big bad is playing a rendition of the Itsy Bitsy Spider to taunt his foe. To quote the man Spider himself, I really hate that song. This is sort of a throwaway reference in the movie, but in The Amazing Spider-Man 2, a news report about Alexei Sitsovich's escape from prison mentions that he escaped from someplace called the Vault. Attentive Marvel Comics fans will know the name immediately, as a S.H.I.E.L.D. prison introduced in Avengers Annual number 15 in 1986. It is one of the many Marvel supervillain holding facilities, but this one is specifically built to hold technologically based criminals. A perfect spot to lock up a version of the Rhino who uses a gigantic robot suit. For our penultimate entry, let's take a look at something that required a little bit of work from viewers. We've talked a lot about the cancelled Sinister Six spinoff in this video, but at one point, it seemed like enough of a sure thing that Sony hit a reference to it in the credits of The Amazing Spider-Man 2. During the credits, an Alicia Keys song called It's On Again plays. Viewers who got out their phones and used the Shazam app to identify the song will be treated to a link to a Daily Bugle mock-up page and several different options, including an option to explore a sinister future. Clicking that link would take you to a hidden scene that we've mentioned before, one where Harry Osborn and Gustav Fiers are well on their way to assembling the Sinister Six. Finally, let's close out on what might yet be another reference to Spider-Man's past. During a scene in The Amazing Spider-Man 2, Peter and Aunt May are talking about getting him paid for his work, sending in spider selfies to the Daily Bugle. May seems to think that it's nice that he's getting paid for the work at all, but Peter tells her that the pay would only be considered generous in 1961. This at first might seem like a reference to the year that Spider-Man was introduced, and we think that it was probably meant to be, but the web-slinger didn't make his debut until the August 1962 Amazing Fantasy number 15. Perhaps it was intended to be a reference to that date, or the development period of the character, or maybe it was just a flubbed line on Andrew Garfield's part. Are you still here? Okay, bonus round. Just one more. These facts, they are just like potato chips. I just can't stop. Now, before we go, let's do one little joke that probably got a laugh out of older fans while sailing right over kids' heads. We all know the words to the old Spider-Man cartoon theme. All that enthusiastic talking about doing whatever a spider can as though spiders fighting crime, trying to maintain a good work-life balance, and experiencing the sad realities of aging into adulthood is one of the most natural things in the world. Anyway, during a conversation with Dane DeHaan's rendition of Harry Osborn, Osborn talks about Peter getting the positive effects of the genetic recombination experiments that were supposed to save his father's life instead. He even goes so far as to tell him that he can do everything that a spider can in a fun little nod to the song. Everyone's talking about Spider-Man No Way Home right now. Will Venom be in it? Will Andrew Garfield and Tobey Maguire be in it? Will Spidey still be a part of the Marvel Cinematic Universe by the time the end credits roll? Before the answers to all of these questions dominate our Spider-Man discussions for the next year,
that feels weird, but I'll allow it.
let's look back at the first Sony Marvel Spidey film to see what we missed the first time around. The Midtown School of Science and Technology students are almost all characters from decades of Amazing Spider-Man comics. The obvious ones are Ned Leeds, Liz Allen, Flash Thompson, and Betty Brant. Then there are the deep-cut references like Abe Brown, aka the Black Tiger, and Sally Averill, aka Bluebird. There's one major Spidey character who goes to this high school that has not gotten nearly enough attention though. That would be Cindy Moon, Spidey's superhero co-star, Silk. She was bit by the same radioactive spider that bit Peter. When Peter finally met her, the two were so biologically attracted to each other that they attacked each other's faces like they were both in an Axe body spray commercial. Luckily, the MCU Cindy seems to have dodged that spider bite, otherwise field trips with her and Peter would have been super uncomfortable for everyone else on that bus. MJ is sort of based on Mary Jane Watson, and is sort of a brand new character made specifically for the MCU. One of the best quirks MJ has is her constant reading of books that are secretly related to the movie that she's in. For instance, Of Human Bondage is about an orphaned kid who lives with his aunt and uncle, like Peter Parker. Another book she reads is Invitation to a Beheading, which is about a man who was in a jail cell with only a dangling spider as a cellmate. Yeah, no wonder she was able to figure out that Peter Parker was Spider-Man all on her own. The universe itself was dropping her hints all over the place. Tom Holland has the playful but overdramatic attitude of Marvel's Peter Parker down perfectly.
Right?
Then there's Marissa Tomei's Aunt May, who is about as far from the comic version of Aunt May. Not trying to throw shade on the comic May, but she looks a lot more like great-great-grandma May than she does Aunt May. I mean, what did Uncle Ben look like in the MCU? Channing Tatum? The movie compensates for this by having May's car be a literal comic book reference. Eagle-eyed fans noticed her license plate reads AMF 1562, which references Amazing Fantasy 15, released in 1962, otherwise known as the first appearance of Spider-Man. This comic is legendary because it was Stan Lee's big swing for his crazy idea to make a relatable teenage superhero based off of something everyone hates, like a spider. Scoring Michael Keaton as the villain for Homecoming was a big get for the MCU. The actor, famously known for playing Batman in Tim Burton's legendary comic book movies, Homecoming itself references how cool this is by having the Vulture appear in front of the moon, calling back to the epic moment where the Batwing flies in front of the moon, making a bat symbol. This is awesome, but it's not nearly as cool as Keaton apparently whispering in Tom Holland's ear, "I'm Batman," constantly during the shoot.
Why are you telling me this?
One of the funniest references in Homecoming comes when Happy moves all of the Avengers gear out of Avengers Tower to the Avengers compound. One of the items was Thor's belt.
And Thor's magic belt.
This belt in Norse mythology was able to double Thor's strength. Weirdly enough, we never officially see Thor use the belt, despite the fact that there are so many times Thor could have used a double strength. The truly ironic part of all of Happy's work in Homecoming is that he moves all of the items to the Avengers compound to keep them safe. They literally all get blown to smithereens by Thanos' army several years later. The MCU movies often have a problem where they don't reference massive events that happen in other movies. Like for some reason no one cares that Malekith and the Dark Elves attack London and then all the 9 realms in Thor the Dark World. Or when AIM kidnapped the President in Iron Man 3. You would think that those would get at least a slight callback. We don't even know if President Ellis milked that whole kidnapping thing to get reelected. Thankfully, Spider-Man Homecoming does a better job of referencing MCU history. Civil War, which happened right before the events of this movie, is constantly getting talked about in the movie. The obvious ones are Peter's home movie version of Civil War, Captain America's PSA, even though he's something of a war criminal now, and Pete's friendship with Tony Stark, which began in the previous film. What's really funny is that there's literally a teacher in the film doing a lesson on the Sokovia Accords. The brief appearance of Donald Glover in Homecoming is like a reference inside of a reference inside of another reference. For one, there was a huge viral campaign to get Glover cast as Spider-Man. This was even referenced by his own show, Community. He also would voice the Miles Morales Spider-Man briefly in Ultimate Spider-Man. Glover would play Miles' uncle Aaron Davis, aka the Prowler in Homecoming. This seemed like it would pay off with a Miles Morales movie that would see him fight his uncle, but instead we got to see that play out in both Into the Spider-Verse and the Spider-Man Miles Morales game. The Easter egg that they snuck in there was the one from Aaron's license plate. UCS M01 references Ultimate Comics Spider-Man 1, the first comic where Miles took the leading role of the Ultimate Spidey franchise. The casting of Homecoming has a lot of fun with MCU references. Most famously, Kenneth Choi, who plays Principal Merida in Homecoming, also played Jim Merida in Captain America: The First Avenger. This is referenced by a framed picture of Jim in the office, signifying that the two are related. Peter's spider suit AI, Karen, is also a reference to the MCU. She's played by Jennifer Connelly, the wife of Paul Bettany, the voice of Jarvis before he went on to become Vision. My favorite one is that Martin Starr's Roger Harrington has arguably been retconned into the Incredible Hulk since Starr appeared in that film as the student who got pizza from Bruce Banner. Apparently he was studying to become a teacher while also probably dating the girl who would pretend to get blipped to get away from him. One of the best Easter eggs in Homecoming addresses one of the biggest existential issues in the Marvel Cinematic Universe. When a literal Norse god drops in to save New York City from another literal Norse god, this would probably cause people to have a religious crisis. In Peter's neighborhood, we see a Korean church in the background. If you translate the sign into English, it reads Korean Church of Asgard. This is now my favorite part of the entire MCU, and it breaks my heart that we'll probably never learn anything else about them. One of the most dangerous items in the entire Marvel Cinematic Multiverse appears briefly in Homecoming. When Happy is transporting all of the Avengers' junk, one of the items appears to be an Ultron head. This is utterly terrifying because before that moment, it was assumed that Vision obliterated the last Ultron drone. One drone remaining, even deactivated, is horrifying. What If showed that Ultron is literally the biggest threat in the entire multiverse. He was able to defeat the Avengers, Thanos, and even the Watcher without breaking a sweat. I mean, that's partially because he doesn't even have any sweat glands, but you know what I mean. One Ultron head remaining means that there's a chance that Tony Stark's greatest failure may return one day to threaten the MCU one more time.
Okay, thank you. All right.
We all know there's nothing Peter Parker likes better than making pop culture references, but there were tons of references to go around during Spider-Man Far From Home. We'll take a look at all the comic book references, hidden jokes, and Easter eggs we managed to spot during the latest Marvel movie. We'll explain why the name of Peter's Venice hotel was so important, and why Jake Gyllenhaal playing Mysterio is the perfect casting choice. In the beginning of Spider-Man Far From Home, we see Nick Fury and Maria Hill are investigating the aftermath of a devastating cyclone. Or at least we see two people who look like Nick Fury and Maria Hill investigating what looks like the aftermath of a devastating cyclone. They walk past a car with a license plate reading 463. The Earth Elemental bears a striking resemblance to the character Sandman, who debuted in the comic book Amazing Spider-Man No. 4, which was released in 1963. Although we know the Elemental is really just a trick played by Mysterio, we still appreciate this obscure comic book throwback reference.
I take people's nightmares and turn them into dream realities.
Let's look at another lesser-known inner joke about the film version of the Spider-Man franchise. We all know Tobey Maguire played Peter Parker in Sony's 2002 movie Spider-Man. But after sustaining an injury, he threatened to pull out of the sequel unless he received a massive increase in pay. Instead, the studio threatened to replace Maguire with Jake Gyllenhaal, and all of a sudden Maguire felt like getting back to work. So really, the fact that Gyllenhaal plays Quentin Beck, a villain who wants to take over for Spider-Man and pretend to be a hero, is pretty amazing.
I'm not even mad. That's amazing.
We especially love how much thought and care Mysterio put into his superhero costume, including making sure his cape stays perfectly wrinkle-free. There's nothing like being blipped out of existence and then having to return to high school to damage the old morale. Jason Iannello co-hosts the Midtown School of Science and Technology morning show with Betty Brant, and to say he's over it is an understatement. While he may not have been putting in his A-game on the school announcements, it's not surprising to those who are familiar with his comic book counterpart. In the comic books, Jason is a member of Flash Thompson's crew of popular kids who really have it out for Peter Parker. But while he likes to bully Peter, he is of course a massive fan of the friendly neighborhood Spider-Man. Brad Davis is another comic book character who appears to be quite different on the big screen. During Far From Home, he competes with Peter Parker for MJ's affections, and for a while he seems to be a serious contender. After all, he's tall, handsome, self-assured, and not trying to balance being a high school student with saving the world. In the comic books, Brad only shows up for a single issue, Amazing Spider-Man No. 188, but he does manage to score a date with Mary Jane. Peter and Mary Jane were on a break at the time and had a rather awkward run-in. But don't feel too badly for Peter because it's not like he didn't see anyone while he and MJ were split up.
We were on a break!
During this time, he was seeing his Daily Bugle co-worker Betty Brant. Yep, the same character who dates Ned in the movie. In Far From Home, we saw Aunt May working for a charity called Homeless Support Food Shelter Hope. Happy Hogan, perhaps too happily, delivers an oversized check bearing the signature of none other than Tony Stark's widow, Pepper Potts. The charity is supposed to help those who have been displaced as a result of the blip. In the comic books, May Parker takes a job working for a similar charity called Food Emergency Aid, Shelter and Training, otherwise known as FEAST. Of course, we're guessing Homeless Support isn't secretly a front for a criminal enterprise like Feast was, but you never know. During the scene where Happy Hogan delivers the giant check to Aunt May, there's another Easter egg you might not have noticed. Behind Peter, you can see a small poster advertising a fight involving someone named Crusher Hogan. In the comic books, Peter Parker first used his astonishing new spider powers to compete in a wrestling match against a man named Crusher Hogan. Needless to say, this Hogan ended up getting crushed by Spider-Man in the ring. Another poster advertises a match between Crusher Hogan and Bonesaw McGraw. When Peter Parker's story was adapted for the 2002 Spider-Man movie, Crusher Hogan was renamed Bonesaw McGraw in order to avoid audiences confusing Crusher Hogan with real-life wrestler Hulk Hogan. Good move, brother! Of course, we assume Crusher Hogan, Happy Hogan, and Hulk Hogan aren't related, but it's kind of fun to imagine that they are. Peter may have entertained a brief wrestling career in the comic books, but that's not the only sport he's interested in. In the comic books, it was established that Peter and his Uncle Ben enjoyed going to see the Mets play together, and in Far From Home, we spotted a Mike Piazza jersey on display in Peter's room. Although we never got to meet Ben Parker in the MCU, it's nice to know that Peter has fond memories of him. Even the suitcase he packs for his trip bears the initials BFP, after his Uncle Ben. There was actually going to be a scene in Homecoming where May gave some of Ben's old clothes to Peter, but it ended up being cut from the movie. For those of us who have ever witnessed or experienced a high school romance, the summer fling between Betty Brant and Ned Leeds hit a little too close to home. While it may have seemed to be pretty spontaneous, the two characters do hit it off in the comic books. As we mentioned earlier, Peter and Betty date, but Betty eventually grows frustrated by Peter's constant disappearances and calls it off. She goes on to marry Ned Leeds, who frankly doesn't have much in common with his comic book counterpart. Only time will tell if these MCU characters will go through the same on-again, off-again relationship they do in the comic books. On the class trip where Betty Brant and Ned Leeds fell in love with one another, they stayed at a hotel called Hotel de Mateus, an unpleasantly moist place located in beautiful Venice. The joke is that the hotel isn't quite a 5-star resort, but comic book fans might find the name de Mateus familiar. J.M. de Mateus is a comic book author who has been responsible for some great storylines about notable Marvel characters like Doctor Strange, Namor the Submariner, and of course, Spider-Man. He even wrote the infamous Kraven's Last Hunt storyline featuring one of Spider-Man's most popular villains, Kraven the Hunter. Could this Easter egg be a hint that we could see Kraven incorporated into the MCU? Well, probably not, but that's not going to stop us from hoping. We might have also been teased about another classic Spider-Man villain during the movie Far From Home. After Peter gets together with Talos masquerading as Nick Fury, he's introduced to an associate known simply as Dimitri. He might not be the most cheerful guy around, but he seems to get the job done until he pretty unceremoniously disappears and it turns out he was working with Quentin Beck. In the comic books, the very first supervillain Peter fights is named Dmitry Smerdyakov, also known as the Chameleon. He uses costumes and makeup in order to change his appearance to go undercover. In fact, Dmitry is also the half-brother of Sergei Kravenov, better known as Kraven the Hunter. Is Marvel Studios just dropping Easter eggs at this point, or are they giving us hints of villainous things to come? Although we now know the water elemental was just a trick perpetrated by Quentin Beck and his accomplices, he does resemble a real Spider-Man villain known as Hydro Man. In fact, when Betty and Ned are taking photos in Venice, you can see a boat which says ASM 212. This represents Amazing Spider-Man number 212, which features the debut of Hydro Man. There's also a scene where Flash Thompson talks about the rumored origin of this creature, which pretty closely mirrors the origin story of Maury Bench, the comic book Hydro Man. Spider-Man ended up sending him flying off his ship during the testing of an experimental generator. This left him with water-based superpowers and a grudge against Spider-Man. In the comics, Hydro Man and Sandman combined their powers into a creature called the Mud Thing, which might not be a great name, but it does look like what happened when the Elementals teamed up to attack the Tower Bridge. Marvel Comics have no shortage of awesome villains we'd like to see adapted to fit the big screen. Spider-Man in particular has an impressive rogue gallery, but you might be surprised to know it doesn't contain creatures known as elementals. This group of characters is comprised of Hellfire, Hydron, Magnum, and Zephyr, and they've never been seen interacting with Spider-Man in any capacity. They're immortal beings who used to rule over all of Earth prior to the rise of Atlantis. But the illusion elementals in Far From Home look more like classic Spider-Man villains Molten Man, Hydro Man, Sandman, and Cyclone. During Spider-Man Far From Home, Peter Parker discovers his late mentor Tony Stark left him one last gift. And in true Tony Stark fashion, it's an incredibly dangerous gift he has no business putting in the hands of a high school student. It may look like an unfashionable pair of sunglasses, but it gives him access to an AI known as Edith, which stands for Even Dead, I'm the Hero. Well, at least it's a better acronym than BARF. However, Agent Carter fans may recall a character named Edith Oberon who is romantically involved with Tony's father, Howard Stark. It might be a coincidence that two potentially dangerous beings were both named Edith, or it could be a big screen nod to a small screen series. We know we have to suspend our disbelief to enjoy Marvel movies, but sometimes they take things too far. Honestly, how could anyone think people would be fooled into thinking Spider-Man was another hero just because he was wearing a black costume instead of a red and blue one? It even had the same signature eye holes and everything. Clearly, MJ wasn't tricked by the appearance of Night Monkey even when Peter tried to explain away the webbing by saying maybe he's a spider monkey. But while that does seem crazy, it actually kind of happened in the comic book during the Marvel Apes miniseries. Yes, it's a real thing, and it's just about as crazy as it sounds. There's Spider Monkey, who has to work with the Ape Vengers who fight against Dr. Octopus. Dr. Octopus. Oh, that's good. During Spider-Man Far From Home, we saw Mysterio fool Peter Parker with a series of complex, over-the-top illusions. Obviously, this is done in the comic books as well, and one even involves a carnival similar to the one we saw in Far From Home. In Amazing Spider-Man number 67, Mysterio tricks Spider-Man into thinking he's been made fun-sized and trapped in a giant carnival where he's at risk of being squashed by Mysterio. See, sometimes it's not that much fun to be a spider. Many of the Far From Home visuals were reminiscent of this issue, including Mysterio's giant hand grabbing a tiny Spider-Man. In Amazing Spider-Man number 218 and 620, Mysterio utilizes drones and robots in a manner similar to the movie version of his character. While Quentin Beck certainly had it out for Tony Stark, he wasn't alone in wanting to besmirch his good name. He led a legion of disgruntled former Stark Industry employees, including one who looked very familiar. William Ginter Riva was in the very first Iron Man movie all the way back in 2008. He was the scientist who Obadiah Stane forced to create his Ironmonger suit and forced him to admit that he wasn't quite on Iron Man's level. If you didn't remember this guy, don't feel too badly. Peter Billingsley first appeared on the big screen in the role 11 years ago and was never mentioned until Far From Home. He currently holds the record for longest absence in the Marvel Cinematic Universe, which is kind of a dubious honor. He also holds the honor of playing Ralphie from A Christmas Story. Whoa, really? No way. Confessing your feelings to someone can be difficult, but it's even more challenging when you're hiding a huge secret like being a superhero. When Peter tries to tell MJ how he feels about her, she claims to be confident that he's Spider-Man. But after he admits it, she says that she's really only about 67% sure. In the comic book Amazing Spider-Man Parallel Lives, there was a controversial storyline which revealed that Mary Jane had always known Peter was Spider-Man. Who knows Peter's secret and how long they've been aware has been a hot topic in the comic books, so it's not surprising this was reflected in the movie as well. We all know Quentin Beck is a bad guy, and we have ever since it was confirmed he would be in this movie. That's right, Marvel Studios, you may have fooled Peter Parker, but we knew Mysterio was going to be revealed as a villain at some point. But even for a bad guy, many felt he went way over the line during one specific hallucination. He caused Peter to believe he was in a cemetery near the grave of Tony Stark. We were also treated to a horrifying and heartbreaking Iron Man zombie, which was a pretty low blow. But in the Marvel Zombies series, many of our beloved superheroes did end up being infected with a zombie virus, and Iron Man is indeed one of them. Not only did we get to see the Skrulls back in action for the first time since Captain Marvel, but we heard mention of the Kree as well. Talos/Nick Fury mentions Kree sleeper cells, which certainly doesn't sound good. This could mean almost anything for the fate of the MCU, but it could have something to do with the Inhumans. In the comic books, the Kree take part in some rather inhumane experiments in an effort to create a genetically superior race. The Inhumans are human-like beings with incredible powers who eventually go on to form their own society. They were also the focus of an incredibly short-lived show, but maybe they'll be incorporated into the MCU at some point in the future. While Peter is incredibly awkward for most of Far From Home, MJ isn't exactly as cool as a cucumber herself. She even admits that she has a hard time getting close to people, but we know pretty much nothing about MJ's background at this point in time. In the comic books, Mary Jane has an abusive father which shapes her life in no small part. We know that the MCU MJ isn't the same as Mary Jane, but it's possible she has a similar sad backstory which could explain why it's hard for her to get close to people. Of course, there are tons of comic book references in Spider-Man Far From Home, but there were also nods to the popular Spider-Man video game for PlayStation 4. One of the features in the game is the ability to take selfies pretty much anywhere at any time. Hey, what more evidence do you need that this is a modern-day Spider-Man than being able to take selfies while swinging through the streets of New York? At the end of the movie, we got to see Peter taking selfies while displaying similar mannerisms and poses to his video game counterpart. MJ might not have been a fan, but we're guessing Spider-Man's other followers will be. It's safe to say that most people love the friendly neighborhood Spider-Man, but J. Jonah Jameson is definitely not one of those people. He has always hated Spider-Man and views him as a dangerous vigilante. This character has been included in pretty much every adaptation of Spider-Man except for the MCU version up until this point. Not only did we finally get to see J. Jonah Jameson in the MCU, but he was portrayed by none other than actor J.K. Simmons, who also played the character in the Spider-Man franchise directed by Sam Raimi. While J. Jonah Jameson definitely hates Spider-Man, the feeling isn't mutual for the most part in the comics. While Peter Parker clearly has some philosophical differences with the man, he respects his right to his opinions and doesn't blame him for not approving of his extracurricular activities. In fact, while J. Jonah Jameson is out to get Spider-Man, he's often shown to be supportive of Peter Parker. In the comics, Jameson goes from the humble Daily Bugle to the sensationalist fake news network known as the Fact Channel. It's like the Marvel version of Alex Jones and his InfoWars, and this is the way he seems to be portrayed in Far From Home. Along with the big reveal of J. Jonah Jameson, we also learned that Mysterio's accomplices have put out the word that Spider-Man is secretly a villain. Footage emerges which seems to show Peter calling for the drone attack on the Tower Bridge, when in reality he was calling it off. This is actually one of Mysterio's oldest tricks, and he set up Spider-Man as a villain the very first time they met. He even managed to make Peter question whether or not he was a villain and had developed a multiple personality disorder. He even visits a psychiatrist to check out his mental health, but eventually realizes he's been fooled by Mysterio. When we saw the real Nick Fury aboard a spaceship filled with Skrulls, we naturally had a ton of questions. But if you haven't kept up with Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D., you might not have noticed that Fury's beach backdrop looked pretty familiar. It certainly seems like a reference to Project Tahiti, which was used to revive Agent Coulson after he perished during the attack on the helicarrier in the Avengers. Coulson ended up with some implanted memories of a beautiful beach in Tahiti, which he couldn't help but describe as a magical place whenever it was brought up.
Spider-Man No Way Home delivers loads of heroes, tons of villains, and of course, like any good Marvel movie, it's packed with Easter eggs and references spanning not just Disney's Marvel Cinematic Universe, but 3 Sony movie universes as well. Oh, did you not know that already? Well, what are you doing here then? This video is obviously full of spoilers. Well, now that that's out of the way, here are the 25 Easter eggs and references I thought were cool as heck in Spider-Man No Way Home. The film hits us with a big reveal fairly early on, and one I was happy to see. About a week prior to the film's release, Kevin Feige said Charlie Cox would remain the MCU's Matt Murdock, aka Daredevil. But in true MCU fashion, he was vague about when, or even if, that would actually be. Well, the timing was obviously intentional, as we're treated to Charlie Cox's appearance as Murdock in Peter and Aunt May's apartment while he helps the gang out of some legal trouble. This is also hot on the heels of Vincent D'Onofrio's reappearance the same week on Disney Plus's Hawkeye series as Kingpin. Fans of Netflix's Daredevil got some good presents this holiday. Oh, and another rad thing here is that it's Jon Favreau's second time playing in a scene with Daredevil. Here, he's Happy Hogan, but he also played Foggy Nelson in the 2003 Ben Affleck Daredevil stinker. Speaking of Hawkeye, and I know this is a Spider-Man video, but we love the MCU for its connections. Yelena Belova mentions to Kate Bishop that while she's in New York, she'd like to visit the new and improved Statue of Liberty. The line is a bit strange since that Hawkeye episode aired literally one day prior to No Way Home's release, but after seeing No Way Home, it's pretty clear she was talking about the huge frickin' Captain America shield that's been added to it. Incidentally, since No Way Home takes place during the summer before Hawkeye, the statue has already been upgraded, partially destroyed, and then rebuilt in time for Yelena to go and see it. One other small but fun Hawkeye nod is that when Peter and MJ are swinging through Times Square, we see billboards for the totally accurate and not at all cringy Rogers the Musical, the very same Avengers-themed Broadway show that Clint Barton endures in the very first episode of Hawkeye. When Doctor Strange first meets the Ancient One in his first solo movie, he says he doesn't believe in souls or the astral dimension. So the Ancient One does what any abusive teacher would do and punches Strange's soul right out of his body. She later, or earlier, depending on how you look at it, uses the same trick on Bruce Banner, punching his soul out of the Hulk's body. It appears that, as usual, Strange was paying attention, as he employs this technique on Peter when he won't hand over the Machina de Cadavis magic spellbox. Why wizards don't just astral punch all their adversaries is a mystery to me, but when he uses it on Peter, it doesn't quite go as planned. Not only does Peter just soul swim back to his body, but his body actively dodges Strange's attempts to reclaim the spellbox. My theory on that is that Peter's tingle or spidey sense is working reflexively. We've seen examples of a spidey sense detecting things Peter would have no way of seeing or hearing, so I guess not having a soul doesn't slow it down either. Speaking of Spidey's powers, while MJ and Peter are hiding out on the roof of their high school for some quiet time, MJ reads a tabloid article that suggests Spider-Man has the powers of hypnosis and has hypnotized MJ into joining his cult of personality. While we know Peter doesn't have that power, another spider person in the comics does. Jessica Drew, aka Spider-Woman, can emit pheromones that make her victims fall in love with her. Fortunately for everyone else, she doesn't like using it because she considers it unethical and, as she mentions in one of her comic stories, releasing the pheromones kind of feels like going pee. Yeah, I wouldn't want to do it either. Set decorators love to hide things on sets, although for all we know it could have been director John Watts himself who planted these Easter eggs. While Peter and MJ are on their school roof, a graffiti tag that says G. Kane can be seen, likely a shout out to comics artist Jill Kane, who drew for Spider-Man at one point. Later, there's a tag on Aunt May's Feast truck that reads Ditko, the last name of Steve Ditko, comic artist and co-creator of Spider-Man, along with Stan Lee. Speaking of Stan Lee, a taxi is shown just before Doc Ock shows up with the license plate 1228, which is Stan Lee's birthday, December 28th. There's another license plate in this scene, but we'll get to that one a bit later. Now from graffiti tags to murals. When Peter Parker is speaking with his old teachers at Midtown High, he stands in front of a mural depicting some great folks from history, including Sir Isaac Newton, Marie Curie, Albert Einstein, and Mae C. Jemison, to name a few. Mae Jemison, in case you didn't know, was the first black woman in space, and additionally, the first real astronaut to appear on Star Trek, with a quick speaking part in a TNG episode from season 6. Okay, back to the MCU. Also appearing on the mural are MCU geniuses Howard Stark and Hank Pym. Wisely, their two portraits are separated by a window, as they famously did not get along. Tony Stark's incompetent grabby robot arm dummy shows up in Happy's condo. Really not sure why anyone keeps this inept robot around. It's basically a Scudder from Red Dwarf. There's an old reference for you.
I wouldn't let them open a can of beans.
But seeing him in this film makes Dummy and Happy the longest running recurring characters in the MCU since they both appear in Iron Man 1. They're like R2-D2 and C-3PO at this point. Anyway, maybe Happy keeps him around as a reminder of Tony. Aw, now I'm sad. Damage Control shows up again, but now they're a federal law enforcement agency that not only cleans up super people's messes, but also super people themselves, since in No Way Home, they come down pretty hard on Peter and his pals. Their function has expanded since they first appeared in Spider-Man Homecoming, where they were shown hostily taking over all the cleanup contracts after the Battle of New York, including the one held by Adrian Toomes, who would later become the Vulture. While under arrest by Damage Control, Peter tries to name-drop Nick Fury, but Agent Cleary tells Parker that Fury has been off-planet for the last year, which is unusually forthcoming. You'd think that would be classified, but oh well. It tracks with what we saw in the Far From Home post-credits, where Fury is very busy doing Skrull stuff in preparation for the Secret Invasion series that's coming to Disney+. I mentioned the Vulture a moment ago, and there's a clever little callback to his daughter, Liz Toomes, who Peter tried to date in Spider-Man Homecoming, but had to ghost because of the whole "your dad's a villain and wants to kill me" thing. I guess she's holding a grudge, because when Strange is chasing Peter, her picture can be seen on the cover of People magazine with the quote, "He's a liar. Let it go, girl. Your dad's a bird, your boyfriend was a spider. It was never gonna work." In the mid-credits scene in Spider-Man Far From Home, we got a brief look at the MCU's version of J. Jonah Jameson, and for this incarnation, he's an internet persona with his own website, thedailybugle.net. Well, No Way Home dives in even further, and has him mirroring real-life internet conspiracy theorist Alex Jones. Jones is so out there that if you told me he was a comic book character and not a real person, I would have believed you. He's also been banned from almost every social media platform, so we're not going to give him any screen time here, but I will call out that Triple J tries to hawk his Daily Bugle supplements, the only other daily fix you need. And while it seems like a quirky little joke, it's a direct reference to Mr. Jones, who funds his platform by selling supplements with names like Alpha Power Vital Male Androgen Biosynthesis Promoter. That is not from a comic book, folks. Okay, moving on to the Spider-Men, who, to make things easier, get numbers in the film. Tom Holland's Spider-Man is Peter 1, Tobey Maguire's Spidey is Peter 2, and Andrew Garfield is Peter 3. While warming up for the big final fight, Peter 2 mentions his back is stiff, which calls back to a moment in Spider-Man 2 when Peter 2 hurts his back, which in turn is a reference to real life when a back injury reportedly almost cost Maguire his role in the first Spider-Man sequel.
My back! Oh, my back!
Sam Raimi, the director of Spider-Man 1, made the choice to have Peter 2's, this is getting weird, Peter 2's webbing be organic and come from his wrists. This is not unprecedented, as there are a few comics examples of Spider-Man that operate this way, but I always thought it was a weird choice. It's hard enough to believe that Spidey can stick to walls with his gloves and boots on, but mutating to have a spinneret in each wrist? I mean, spiders don't produce webs from their legs, you know. It comes out near their... Well, anyway, the other Peters are as confused as I am, but Peter 2 doesn't really want to talk much about it. Good for him. Let's move on. The Spider-Man pointing at Spider-Man meme, using an image from the 60s Spider-Man cartoon, is sort of recreated in the high school science lab when Ned calls out for Peter's attention and all three Peters answer, and then point at each other. It's not bang on, but as we'll discuss later, it would seem that the writers are somewhat meme savvy at least, so we'll say it was an intentional reference. It's no secret that the Amazing Spider-Man films with Andrew Garfield weren't quite as beloved as the original Tobey trilogy. Well, at least the first two Tobey films. And in No Way Home, Garfield's Peter 3 is a little down on himself while preparing for the big fight. I think it's actually one of the most heartwarming scenes when Tobey's Peter 2 peps him up by telling him, well, you guessed it, that he's amazing. And honestly, I think Garfield was an amazing Spider-Man, it's just that his movies kinda sucked. The Amazing Spider-Man 2 tackles a story from the comics that no other film has taken on. Peter Parker's inability to save his girlfriend Gwen Stacy from dying. His grief is palpable when he tells Peter 1 about Gwen, and he's clearly reminded of Gwen when he sees Peter 1 and MJ interact in the high school lab. In the final battle, on the new and improved Statue of Liberty, MJ is thrown from the statue and a goblin bomb explodes. Peter 1 is unable to save her, so Peter 3 jumps to the rescue and the scene plays out almost as it did in The Amazing Spider-Man 2, complete with the same audio cues. But this time, instead of Peter 3 webbing Gwen and her head hitting the ground, he catches MJ and shoots a web upwards, stopping the fall and saving her. Peter 3 finally gets the redemption moment he never really had because he didn't get a third film. I take back what I said earlier. This is the most heartwarming moment in the film. After Max Dillon, aka Electro, is defeated, he sees Peter 3's face for the first time and comments that since Spider-Man was from Queens and helps a lot of poor people, that he always assumed Spider-Man would be black. He then posits there must be a black Spider-Man somewhere. Well, we all know Miles Morales exists somewhere, and it's both black and Latinx. Spider-Man Homecoming showed us Danny Glover as Aaron Davis, the uncle of Miles, although in the film there was no official mention of Miles' existence. I guess we'll have to wait a little bit longer for that one. Let's talk villains. Moments before Dr. Otto Octavius, aka Doc Ock, first appears on the bridge, we can see a license plate on the MIT Assistant Vice Chancellor's car that reads 63ASM3, which can only mean Amazing Spider-Man number 3 from 1963, the very first appearance of Dr. Octopus in the comics. It's a cool little nod, but imagine if your license plate dictated which supervillain would appear to destroy you. I'm telling you the honest truth when I say a friend of mine once, as a joke, customized his car's license plate to say Lou Bega. And now I'm trying to imagine what that battle would have looked like. Speaking of Dr. Octopus, Otto may be a scientific genius, but he's not so creative when it comes to metaphors, since he's still on about his fusion reactor from Spider-Man 2, referring to it again as the power of the sun in the palm of his hand. When he sees one of Tony Stark's miniaturized arc reactors, he says exactly the same thing, suggesting that maybe English Lit was pushed aside for his engineering studies. The Amazing Spider-Man 2's Electro was very, blue. A design choice some fans were unhappy with. In the comics, Electro is a human wearing a green suit with yellow lightning bolts and honestly a quite goofy lightning bolt mask that kinda looks like a star. It's not uncommon for films to alter costumes for the big screen so they don't look quite so, well, comical. But Smurf Electro was a big change, and it's nice to see not only Electro with a more grounded costume, but there is also a little tip of the hat to his classic comic mask. When Dr. Kirk Connors, aka the Lizard, is locked up in Strange's basement, Ned calls him a dinosaur more than once. At first I thought it was just a cute gag, but I caught a line from The Amazing Spider-Man when Police Captain George Stacy is talking on the phone to the mayor, and he says, well, I'll let you hear it.
I can assure you if there was a giant dinosaur running around the streets of Manhattan, you would be the first to know.
In the high school lab, Ned asks Peter 2 if he has a best friend. Peter 2 says he did, meaning Harry Osborn, but that Harry tried to kill him and then died in his arms. Ned is seriously distraught by this and later promises Peter 1 that he won't turn into a supervillain and try to kill him. This kind of digs into something that happens in the comics version of Ned Leeds, who sort of becomes the Hobgoblin, but was actually brainwashed and wasn't actually the Hobgoblin in the end. I really can't see this kind of thing happening to MCU Ned, but I'm ready to eat my words in a few years since there is a collection of ceremonial-looking weapons on the wall in his house, as well as some green and gold fabric shown on a sewing machine. Who knows? But I will say that comics Ned is a totally different guy than MCU Ned. Okay, from not quite Hobgoblin to the Green Goblin, Norman Osborn gets some really good moments in this film. After battling Peter 1 on the bridge, we later see Norman ditching his mask in a dumpster in a way that honors an iconic panel from Spider-Man number 50 when Peter decides to give up being Spider-Man and ditches the Spidey suit in the same way. It's a great homage, but honestly, I'm just happy the film decided to rid the Green Goblin of his mask. I always thought it was a major misstep in the original Spider-Man films to hide Willem Dafoe's performance under a mask while he was the Goblin, and No Way Home proves me right, as Dafoe delivers some amazing performances as the unmasked Goblin. I mentioned earlier that I have to believe the writers of No Way Home know their memes, and they come through with the one line I was actually dying to hear but didn't think that I would. While locked in Doctor Strange's basement, Norman Osborn offers to help the gang cure the other villains by stating that he's something of a scientist himself. This line is taken from the first Spider-Man when Norman Osborn first meets Peter 2 and is often used to meme on someone when they are totally not a scientist.
You know, I'm something of a scientist myself.
At the end of the film, when the universe is falling apart at the seams, just before Doctor Strange casts his final spell, there are indistinct blue glowy beings that appear to be just waiting to enter the MCU and come after Spider-Man. I took a pretty close look, and most are actually just blobs, but there is one very distinct silhouette of a person with a spear, and you gotta believe that's Kraven the Hunter, a longtime Spidey adversary who's getting his own film in 2023, starring Aaron Taylor Johnson. That's a Sony film, though, in the same universe as Venom and the upcoming Morbius, so don't expect to see Kraven in the MCU anytime soon. Another silhouette looks like it has a large tail and is probably a nod to some version of the Scorpion. Spider-Man Homecoming does introduce a version of Mac Gargan, the best known Scorpion, but aside from a tattoo on his neck, this character hasn't really gone anywhere. Sometimes a tease is really just a tease. Not sure about you, but I was kinda waiting all movie for Eddie Brock and Venom to show up. True to the wacky style of the Venom films, what we got was just kinda weird. In a post-credit scene from Venom 2, Eddie and Venom are taking a break in Mexico, and just as Venom is about to show Eddie some cosmic wonders, they're transported to the MCU. It isn't explained then how this happens, but we now know that this was Doctor Strange's botched forgetting spell. In the No Way Home mid-credit scene, we see that Eddie and Venom just stayed in Mexico for the events of the film, and honestly, can you blame them? Looking back on the film now, adding these two characters would have probably pushed the film over from balancing a lot of spinning plates to an all-out train wreck. So it's probably for the best. However, the writers did leave the Venom possibilities wide open, because Venom leaves a little blobette of himself behind in the MCU when he and Eddie return to their own Sonyverse. Well, they did it. They pulled it off. Never did I think I would see a movie event quite like this. The licensing agreements between Marvel, Disney, and Sony made it seem like we'd never even see Spider-Man in the MCU, much less 3 Spider-Mans. Spider-Mans, all at once. Not only that, seeing Maguire and Garfield in this film has actually renewed my fondness for their versions of Peter Parker. And I'm not the only one, because at the time of making this video, fans online are calling for an Amazing Spider-Man 3 for Andrew Garfield, which, hey, I'm not going to make predictions anymore, because I guess almost anything can happen now. So those are the Easter eggs and references I thought were cool in Spider-Man No Way Home, and yes, there are others I didn't touch on, like comparisons to the One More Day and One Moment in Time story arcs in the comics, but those require so much backstory I didn't want to get into it here. But I urge you to look up a plot synopsis, or hey, even read those stories if you're interested. Oh, and ever since WandaVision, I'm not even going to entertain any more Mephisto theories until we're shown something way more solid.
Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse is chock full of a lot of things. Profoundly written characters, comic book-inspired visuals, deep-cut villains, music you can really tap your foot to. Oh, and Easter eggs. And, other things you, might have missed. With the sequels now official with that sick new teaser, I'd say it's time we take a journey through dimensions and check out, let's say 25-ish things you might have missed. Sure, let's do that.
It's a hell of a freaking light show. You're gonna love this.
I know my diehard Marvel brethren didn't necessarily miss this one, but just in case you blinked for 5 seconds, gotta start with the various Marvel Earths that make up the various comic continuities. We got Earth 616, the primary universe. Then we have 1610, Miles' universe, as well as the Ultimate Universe, where the character originated in the comics. Then there's Earth 14512, a Japanese sci-fi inspired universe in which Spider-Man is essentially a mech suit piloted by a girl named Penny Parker. Earth 65 is Spider-Gwen's dimension, more on that in a bit. And Earth 8311 is populated by anthropomorphic cartoon animals, while Earth 90214 is basically just, what if all the superheroes debuted in the 20s and 30s and were like film noir characters or something? And they're all shown on Kingpin's little screen here for a brief moment while the Collider is doing its, universe consolidation thing, whatever it's supposed to be doing. Bridging the universes, whatever. This Green Goblin here made a lot of folks go, wait, what? And that's understandable. Dude's huge. Norman's eating his Wheaties. And the reason for his immensity is simple enough. This isn't Earth 616. We literally, we just covered this right up top. Like, why? This should be obvious. Anyway, Earth 1610's Green Goblin is a real ugly some gun. Speaking of Gobby, you can hear his scream from Sam Raimi's Spider-Man in the scene where Miles is sneaking up on Spider-Man versus Goblin. It was added in by composer Daniel Pemberton as part of the score. Those suits in the Spider Cave are, of course, all based on actual Spidey suits. You got your Electro-proof suit from Amazing Spider-Man 425. You got the modded-out advanced suit from the video game, the Iron Spider, the Secret Wars suit, this weird one that could either be a Carnage reference or maybe just Scarlet Spider without his fun hoodie, the stealth suit from the Big Time story arc, the Mark I spider armor from Peter's fight with the new Enforcers in Web of Spider-Man number 100. Downright iconic cover art, by the way. And then there's this guy who I'm pretty sure is supposed to be the Webman costume, which is just like an inverse of Spider-Man when Dr. Doom tried to make a clone thing with a twin machine. It's very dumb. It's in Spidey Super Stories number 25. Although I have seen some people suggest it's Flipside 2099. I don't think that's the case. I think it's just a Webman joke, because Webman is silly. The Mark II armor that debuted a little after the stealth suit, and the caped costume from What If number 19. Over at Uncle Aaron's place, that's Community playing on the TV, specifically the episode where Donald Glover wears Spider-Man pajamas, which of course was a reference to his quest to play Spider-Man, itself an experiment to see how far a message could be amplified via social media. This shot was cited by Brian Michael Bendis as an inspiration for Miles' look in the comics, and of course, Donald Glover also played Aaron Davis, uncle to Miles, obviously, in Spider-Man Homecoming. And in a deleted scene, he even talks to Miles on the phone, whom he misses out on seeing because Spidey webs his hand to his car. Oh, Pete, you jerk. Dude had ice cream in the car for his nephew. Like, geez, come on, guy.
Come fix this.
2 hours. You deserve that.
I got ice cream in here,
You deserve
man.
that. You're a criminal. Bye, Mr. Criminal.
In Times Square, when Burrito Peter here is transported to Earth 1610, we get a whole bunch of slightly off posters to show that this is a slightly different world to ours. These include Hold Your Horses, a Seth Rogen vehicle that appears to feature him as a stoned horse jockey, Kitten Heels instead of, Kinky Boots, maybe? I don't really know Broadway musicals that well. Stage Spidey Reeve Carney did do a production of Kinky Boots, so I don't know, maybe that's a reference. Then there's From Dusk Till Dawn, the unmade sequel to Shaun of the Dead, which obviously got made here, and not our universe, gosh dang it. And Hi Hello, a variation on the John Mulaney, Nick Kroll stage show, and a phenomenal Netflix special, Oh Hello.
Bam, that says, baby!
And I guess Inglewood is Hollywood in this universe based on this Planet Inglewood sign, which is, that's a fun creative idea. I feel like the obvious joke is to just make it Planet Hollywood Land or something as a reference to the old version of the Hollywood sign, but switching it arbitrarily to another city in that area is cute. The movie Baby Shower, presumably a sequel to Bridesmaids, also exists, which seems like something that should have happened in this universe, because, box office receipts. And the Blue Man Group is now apparently the Nightmare Fuel Group. Jesus. We also have this Mr. Tomato Head, which raises a lot of questions about the origins of that toy. Oh, and there's a poster for the Mary Janes, which is the band that Spider-Gwen plays drums for in her universe. And the New York Red Sox exist. And I just noticed the Romita Ramen sign, a clear reference to either John Romita Sr. or Jr. Senior Romita was a major Spider-Man artist, while his son is also a major Spider-Man artist. Apple really doesn't fall far from the tree, does it? There's also this sign that shows Stephen Curry became a pro golfer in this universe, and one that shows basketball player Blake Griffin as a baseball player. Oh, and there's, Jesus Christ, there's also an Il Giornale. Il Giornale? I don't remember how to say it. I'm taking Italian on Duolingo, and I don't remember how to say journal. Anyway, Il Giornale, which was a rival to Starbucks, created by Howard Schultz before he became CEO of Starbucks. Now, that one's actually a really interesting story. Basically, Schultz already worked for Starbucks, but after owners Jerry Baldwin and Gordon Boker vetoed his pitch to sell Italian-style espresso drinks at Starbucks, he left to start his own company, Il Giornale, which is Italian for the newspaper, as well as being the name of an actual Italian newspaper, which I believe is what he based it on. Anyway, when Starbucks management decided to focus on another property, Pete's, they sold Starbucks to Schultz, and he rebranded his Il Giornale venture as, well, Starbucks. So yeah, that's the bare bones explanation behind this extremely brief reference that you've probably missed. Spidey also hits a sign for Coca Soda, which in this universe is just a, stand in for Coca-Cola. So there's also that. I don't have a fun historical anecdote about Coke, but that's it's a funny name. In Miles' room, you can see the cover art for Chance the Rapper's mixtape coloring book, except the 3 is now a 4, because again, different universe. In Earth 1610, Chance the Rapper obviously released another mixtape before coloring book, meaning this might just be the superior universe. There's also this poster for Clone College, which is a fake sequel or revival series of the MTV show Clone High, which Spider-Verse producers Lord and Miller created in 2002 for a single season. It followed a bunch of clones of historical figures, including Abraham Lincoln, Joan of Arc, John F. Kennedy, Gandhi, and Cleopatra, as they attend a high school dedicated entirely to young clones of historical figures. If you haven't checked it out, you should, because it's pretty much a perfect show outside of the whole getting canceled way too soon thing.
My abs are so firm you can grate cheese on them!
The Fuldsmerdorf, I don't remember, it's been so long since I saw this movie. The FLDSMDRF.
The Flintstone
Limited Reserve?
From Cloudy with a Chance of Meatballs, directed by Lord and Miller, also shows up in the Super Collider, which, who knows? Maybe we'll get an Andy Samberg cameo in the next one. I don't know. There's so many references in this movie. Jesus. Oh, back to Peter B. Parker for a sec. He says that he once broke his back, which is one of many references to the Tobey Maguire version of Peter Parker.
My back! Oh, my back!
The broken back thing goes a bit deeper as well, as that line's inclusion in Spider-Man 2 is a direct reference to an injury he had sustained playing the character. The company Alchemax plays a large role in the film and is an actual fictional company in the Spider-Man 2099 universe, which means we've probably not seen the last of them, seeing as how he's back after his post-credits reveal in this film to feature more prominently in the upcoming 2-part sequel, which I am just so freaking, I'm gonna be honest, it's hard for me to make this video because I'm so excited for that movie that I just want to make a video about whatever the heck that ends up being. So pumped! So, here's a cool one that I know showed up in a bunch of articles back when the film came out, but just in case you weren't neck deep in Twitter think pieces back then, here it is. There are a ton of creative uses of animation throughout this film. Most obviously the use of comic book drawing and coloring techniques like the Ben-Day dots used to cheaply color old comics, here used to enhance the visual style and certain elements of the look. The filmmakers also chose to experiment with the frame rate. See, most films are shot and presented in 24 frames per second. That's why when Peter Jackson experiments with a higher frame rate, or you see a soap opera presented in 30 FPS, it looks a bit off. or why motion smoothing is an actual crime against TVs across the planet. Our eyes are naturally trained from a century of film to see 24 frames per second and go, yep, that's cinema, baby. Well, in Spider-Verse, it was decided to animate certain elements at different frame rates, and no, Reddit warriors, it wasn't a cost-cutting measure. For Miles in particular, the reasoning was that they wanted to get across how inexperienced Miles is. He's a kid who doesn't really know what he's doing, so he's animated at 12 frames per second, which is most noticeable when he's swinging along with Burrito Peter later on in the film, when Miles actually takes on the role of Spider-Man and reaches the, ultimate point of his character arc. He suddenly switches to 24 frames per second. That's art. That's art right there. That's so good. Oh my goodness. Oh, details.
And then is this Dr. Otto Octavius? Are these two siblings?
Among Miles' sketches is this rough mock-up of Leopardon, the mech suit used by Takuya Yamashiro, the Spider-Man of Earth 51778, aka the universe occupied by the Japanese Spider-Man TV show, which has since become comic book canon thanks to the Spider-Verse arc and various other appearances. It's also just a fun, weird show. The number 42 appears at least twice throughout Spider-Verse, on the spider that bites Miles, and here when Miles has an uh-oh fall. This is a reference to the jersey number of Jackie Robinson, who of course was the first African-American to play in Major League Baseball. If you pay attention to the scene wherein Peter Parker is being pushed into the Collider's time energy blasty boys, you notice we get a look at all the other Spideys as they're being taken by the time portal. Just look at Burrito Peter's little tum-tum. When we get the flashback to Spider-Gwen's time, we see that her Peter Parker has scaly skin. This is a reference to that universe's Peter Parker, who takes on the powers of the Lizard. Oh, and there's all these Stan Lee cameos. The one that made us all actively cry upon first viewing is obvious enough, but he also shows up here as these two have their joint uh-oh fall, and he shows up in various trains throughout the film. Dude gets around, just like the real Stan Lee, I assume. He was a happily married man. What am I saying? Miles' phone contacts are also worth noting. You got B. Bendis and Sarah Pichelli, aka the creators of Miles Morales, as well as Ray Sean, aka the superhero Patriot, whom Miles teams up with in the comics. Jason Reynolds wrote the literal book on Miles Morales. Monica C. up here could be Monica Chang, which is a bit of a stretch, but she takes on the Black Widow mantle in the Ultimate Comics. No wonder his old classmates missed him. Dude, he's a popular kid. During the sequence wherein Kingpin sees variations of his wife and son, we get a brief shot of Sister Maggie and Matt Murdock, aka Daredevil. There's also a blink and you'll miss it shot of a black version of his wife and son, which might be a reference to the Fox film version of Kingpin, who of course was played by the late great Michael Clark Duncan. If Miles' roommate looks familiar, that's because he's Gank Lee, who is also Miles' best friend in the comics and was the inspiration for Ned Leeds in the MCU Spider-Man films. The post-credit scene, which again introduces us to Spider-Man 2099, and holy cow, I cannot wait to see him in Across the Spider-Verse. God dang! Oh, it's gonna be so rad. It's gonna be so rad. Anyway, that scene is also, of course, the highly memed dual Spidey shot from the 60s Spider-Man cartoon show. Specifically, it's from Season 1, Episode 19, To Catch a Spider and Double Identity, and finishing out on another blink and miss it reference. When Miles is being pulled down the train tracks, he passes a sign that reads Perry Joe, a clear reference to Aerosmith guitarist Joe Perry, who of course wrote the theme song for everyone's favorite animated Spider-Man show, Spider-Man, the Animated Series. Which, I mean, for being super honest, the best show is Spectacular Spider-Man, but that's a rant for another day.
And just when I was having so much fun being ignored.
Kind of side note, you notice how many Spider-Verse actors have shown up in the MCU now? You got your Kathryn Hahn, you got your Oscar Isaac, you got your Brian Tyree Henry, you got your Mahershala Ali, and most recently, you got your Haley Steinfeld. I don't know why I'm saying this in an accent. Here's hoping Post Malone is cast as, I don't know, Dupe